Good evening, everyone. So, carrying on, just finishing up with the websites tonight. We were talking last night. I started discussing this idea of Zilzul Shabbat, Ziluta de Shabbat, different names it's called in the scheme. So we said comes up in very many different contexts. We started reading the Tshuva together of the Chelkat Yaakov. So I just want to complete that. Just finish the Tshuva that I started reading last night very quickly. We'll see an interesting response to that. We'll see if that ties in, how this all ties into the websites at the end of the day. If we have time, we'll talk about something else, but probably won't. So he says like this, says the Chelkat Yaakov. Remember, the question was somebody who has a electronic secretary, what we call an answering machine, probably in more modern language. But essentially, again, I don't know exactly what the technical description is, but in his day, this is something which is quite new. Somehow the office is going to, you have to do something manually to extend it, to operate it, that the office is going to continue to work, to take messages for you if people call. The question was, is this permissible, or does this give off the impression that you're working on Shabbat? Is there somehow some sort of work that you're doing on Shabbat? And again, he says, technically speaking, you haven't done anything, but he very, very strongly warns against it. So not just recommends, he says you can't do it. And he says like this, he says, this is what we've said, be careful with your words, addressing the sages, addressing the poskim. He says, Bizman technic, right? These electronic things, are just advancing. Mentioned yesterday, one day, maybe you'll have a shop which will operate automatically. You'll have people will come and they'll buy things, and there won't be anyone physically serving them. They'll just take their goods, they'll pay their money. He's already writing this decades ago. He says, if now we're going to start saying all sorts of things are just done by themselves, the automation, where are we going to end up? Today you see this. There are all sorts of questions, all sorts of things of automation, which come up really every single day, these questions on Shabbat. He says this was before anybody had, thought of the concept of a smart home or the Internet of Things or any of these things. But he says, Yitzmach mizeh chilul Shabbat gadol. This is going to lead to a great chilul Shabbat. Shadam b'shifto beit hamidrash or shulchano shel sudat Shabbat. Menagin zmirot lichvot Shabbat. Person sitting in their home and they're singing zmirot. They're having their seudah. And at the same time, Yiskor misrado oved b'Shabbat avuro kivimot achor. And their office and their factory is working just like it would on a weekday. Nowadays the shaila is very, very different. Nowadays the shaila is, I thought it made me think of it when I read what he says. Person sitting at home singing their Zmirot Shabbat, right? And the speakers are going to join in and start playing the Zmirot with them. That's the shaila that gets asked nowadays. Alexa, can you use it on Shabbat? The answer is no. But there are things. The next stage. Nowadays you have these voice activated machines. The next stage is where it's thought activated machines. Right. So instead of nowadays, it's this will be the old technology very soon. You have to say, you've got the speaker sitting in your lounge. You say, Alexa, can you play me a song? And it will play a song. And the next stage is, you don't have to say anything. You'll just think in your head. This technology already exists. By the way, there are earphones that you can get, and the person just thinks about the song that they want to hear, and it is able to play that. So again, these are all fascinating questions. Shout out for tonight's Shiur at 8 o'clock in terms of technology of the future and halakha. So stay tuned for that. We won't be discussing this question, but other fascinating things. So he says, the fact is we have to see where things are going. And we have to say that if we just say things are going to work automatically by themselves, where's it going to lead? What's the Shabbat going to look like? He invokes the Ramban that I mentioned last night. Won't read it again, but the Ramban who talks about Shabbaton. And he says, after Be'emet Chiluk Gadol Yesh, he says, there is a difference over there. The Ramban is talking about a scenario where everybody comes to their shops, opens everything up, and is doing all the, not doing any melacha d'oraita, but doing all their business. He says over there, Ramban Ma'arik Shadam Toreach Imo B'Yom HaShabbat B'Avdut V'Tircha. That's a situation where people are doing the work themselves. Okay. Lo ken k'shadam ino oseh klum, Here you're not doing anything. Here the machine's doing everything for you. He says, מכל מקום, העובדה בעצמה שהעסק שלו עובד בפרהסיה בשבת, במקח וממכר עבורו, right? He says the fact that your business is working for you in a public way, it's doing something, that's not Shabbaton, that's not Zachoret Yom HaShabbat, and that's going to be, therefore he says, forbidden. When these things are happening in one's home. So it's interesting, they bring here in the Tshuva, that was the Chalukat Yaakov, Shut Be'er Moshe writes back to him, and he writes the following. This is his response. He says, La'iti b'tshuvat Chalukat Yaakov, shemitchila katav kimat kachor dvarai. Amazing, you see the language of the Tshuva. He says, I had a look at this Tshuva, I see you've written exactly the same thing that I've said. That actually, again, strictly speaking, there's nothing forbidden about what you're writing about. אולם אחר כך עשה לעצמו לדיין גזירה וגוזר גזירה חדשה שבוודאי אין ביד שום רב יהיה מי שיהיה לגזור מעצמו גזירות חדשות. He says, but you've come along, you've said, technically speaking, there's nothing wrong, everything's okay, but then you've said it's asur. Where does that come from? Who are you? Who's to decide? We're making new gzerot. He said, בוודאי, אם גדולי רבנים דזמננו יגזרו גזירה uvaskamai alul exor. He says, for sure, if all the Rabbanim will get together today and decide that something is asur, good luck with that, all the Rabbanim coming together and deciding on the same thing. But he says, definitely we'd accept it. But yeah, there's a dat yachid, Rav Yachidi is bringing a new gzera, and therefore we don't have to accept it. Okay, so that is in terms of that question of the mazkira electronic, this answering machine, electronic secretary, whatever it is. And be'emet, there's no over there. It doesn't seem to be an isur. It doesn't seem to be right. The poskim don't seem to accept that in that particular instance it's forbidden. But the principles that come out of it, and what would the Chalukat Yaakov say back? It's I'm not inventing new gzerot. So the concept of that you have to keep the Shabbat, the concept you have to keep the Shabbaton, the concept that you have to keep the character of the Shabbat, as we discussed last night, that's built into the framework of the halacha of Shabbat. The question is, where does it apply? Right? We have new things which they didn't have in the days of Chazal. They didn't have phones and they didn't have smart devices or smart homes or anything. Now all these things are coming up. We're going to have to decide where it applies and where not. So does it apply to the internet, to the website? It seems to be, right? The conclusion over here is that this, again, our question is just having your internet, your website open, for somebody who is not keeping Shabbat, is going to end up going onto it. That in and of itself does not seem to be the Zilzul Shabbat, right? Nothing's happening in your home. Nothing's happening that you are doing in a public way. What I was thinking afterwards, what might be, is again, if somebody is going on the website, we said there's no issue of chashad or marit ayin because everybody knows that these things work by themselves and they work automatically, right? What if you have a website that has a customer service on many websites nowadays? You go on, it could be the bank, could be a shop, whatever. The message pops up. You have this on Jewish websites as well. Hello, I am Rabbi so and so. How can I help you? Right? People have seen this, and not everybody knows. But most of the time, you start chatting and you start typing things in. When you start asking it sophisticated questions, you usually realize that you're not talking to a human being on the other side. You're talking to a chatbot. Truth is, these chatbots are getting better and better. But if everybody knows and it's clear and it's obvious that you're just talking to a machine, maybe that in and of itself would not be a problem. But if it's not obvious and it's built in such a way that it's meant to give you the impression that you're talking to a human being on the other side, right? A person goes in. Would that chatbot have to be closed for Shabbat? That may be more of a chashad and more of a question there of marit ayin. But that's it. And at the end of the day, conclusion over here as well is that this is not considered farhesia. Like if we have a factory that's open, you have it on the web, on the site. That's not because most people, certainly, as you said, the people that are keeping Shabbat are not going to be able to, are not going to see it, are not going to witness it. So that concludes the discussion regarding websites as well. There's another question which ties into this. I'll just mention briefly. Fascinating question. These questions we've been looking at come from Chelek Hey of Shupar Maariv, which, as I mentioned, was published about 20 years ago. So a lot more recently was published Chelek Chet. I said they're up to Chelek Tet. But in Chelek Chet, there's a question that was asked regarding urban elevators. Okay, urban escalators. Sorry, that's what they're called. Which is something I saw this was in the news this week as well. Which is where I think everybody knows what an escalator is, right? You have at the airport as well. Sometimes you have the the flat ones to walk electronic walkways. So there are plans. They have this in certain places in the world where they have outdoor huge electronic walkways. There is a plan. Apparently, it's planning. So probably take another 20 years before it happens. But in Jerusalem, to build with some of the new train stations and to put electronic walkways, outdoors. The question was, can these things be allowed on Shabbat or not? So again, here the question. I'm not going to give a final answer, but on the one hand, you might say, what's the difference between that and a Shabbos lift? Right, the Shabbos lift goes.
Does it go automatically all the time, or it only goes on when you get on?
Yeah, fair. So that's obviously the first question. Meaning the first question is going to be, is there any technically? Are you doing any malachot? If it is of a situation whereby it's off, and when somebody approaches, there's a sensor, and then it starts, you walking on operates it. That's going to be a question. It's a question of malachat, right? To the Rabbanan, whatever it is, but there's going to be an issue. But assuming it has a Shabbat mode, assuming Machon Somet or whoever else helps them, you laugh, but it's done. It's really done, right? Would that be something? On the one hand, you could say, maybe it's just like a lift. The lift goes up and down. This goes, across. Same thing. Or you could say, maybe this is something which has never been done before. This is something which is uvdin dechol. This is something which people don't use, which doesn't have the, have the character of Shabbat. So that's a discussion, and that would be on the, the local rabbanim and the poskim to decide whether that would be appropriate or not. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha Omer, Tzakadosh Baruch Hu Zakot Yisrael, V'shachach B'aleim Torah Mitzvot, Shneimar D'nei Chafetz Zman Tzidko, Yagdil Torah V'Yadin.